The hidden formula. How America actually became a superpower. Forget the high school textbooks. America's rise to global dominance wasn't just about innovation or democracy. The real, hidden formula involves strategic financial warfare, massive debt leverage, and a geopolitical playbook perfected over a century. Are you ready to see the ruthless, untold strategy behind the world's most powerful economy? The conventional narrative of American superpower status rests on ideals, freedom, innovation, and technological dynamism. While these factors are crucial, they obscure a more complex, often ruthless, financial and geopolitical mechanism perfected by U.S. policymakers since the early 20th century. This is the hidden formula, a structural framework designed not just to ensure American prosperity, but to subordinate the global financial system to U.S. interests. The formula rests on three pillars of strategic dominance. First, the financial weaponization of the dollar. The Bretton Woods Agreement, 1944, and its subsequent dissolution, the Nixon shock, cemented the dollar as the world's primary reserve and trade currency, granting the U.S. unmatched power to run massive persistent trade deficits, effectively funding its consumption and military with foreign savings, the exorbitant privilege. Second, strategic debt leverage and innovation. The U.S. government, particularly through its defense and intelligence agencies, DARPA, CIA, directly funded foundational technologies, GPS, Internet, decades before they became commercial successes, transferring massive, taxpayer-funded R&D risk to the private sector for massive private profit. Third, geopolitical capital control. The U.S. successfully used World Wars I and II to dismantle European industrial competition, converting former rivals into debtors and military dependents, the Marshall Plan's true function. Today, this continues through strategic sanctions and control over global financial messaging systems, SWIFT. The true lesson for investors and citizens is that American power is fundamentally a financial structure, making the U.S. Treasury and the Federal Reserve the most powerful geopolitical tools in history. To understand this structural reality and how to profit from it, stick around and make sure you subscribe to Secret Wealth Tactics, the foundation, from debtor to banker. The ascent of the United States to the status of a singular global superpower is often romanticized as a natural progression, a triumph of democratic ideals and innate ingenuity. While these elements certainly contributed, the true hidden formula for American dominance is rooted in a deliberate, ruthless, and historically unprecedented financial transformation, the systematic process by which the nation converted itself from the world's largest debtor into the world's ultimate creditor and banker. This foundational shift, largely concentrated around the two world wars, was not an accident of history, but a geopolitical masterstroke that secured the financial infrastructure necessary for 70 years of global hegemony. At the turn of the 20th century, the United States was, in a very real sense, still a financial junior. Its rapid industrialization throughout the late 19th century was heavily financed by European capital, primarily British, French, and German investors, who poured vast sums into American railroads, factories, and municipal bonds. The U.S. was a rapidly growing market, but its financial structure was dependent on the stability and liquidity of European money centers, particularly London. This fundamental financial reality was shattered, irrevocably, by the eruption of the First World War. World War I acted as the initial, colossal great wealth transfer. As the European powers descended into a brutal, multi-year industrial conflict, they found themselves desperately needing two things: immense quantities of American industrial goods, steel, munitions, food, raw materials, and, crucially, massive amounts of capital to pay for the war effort. European nations, particularly Britain and France, began liquidating their vast holdings of U.S. and global assets to pay for American supplies. Simultaneously, the U.S. government and private banks began extending huge lines of credit to the Allies. The flow of gold, the undisputed currency of global finance, reversed course entirely, flowing out of the treasuries of Europe and into the vaults of the Federal Reserve. This dynamic was purely transactional, yet profoundly transformative. By the time the U.S. entered the war in 1917, and certainly by the armistice in 1918, The United States had ceased being the world's largest debtor and had become a substantial net creditor. European nations owed the U.S. government and its financial institutions billions. The economic consequences were stark. The industrial infrastructure of Europe was left battered and indebted, while the American industrial machine was left unscathed, operating at maximum capacity, and now owed enormous sums by its former financial masters. This was the first, crucial structural shift in the hidden formula. However, the First World War's financial shift was merely a precursor. The consolidation of power was achieved during the interwar period and cemented by World War II. The subsequent global financial instability of the 1922 and the Great Depression of the 1930s further entrenched U.S. financial power by weakening the last vestiges of European financial dominance. The competitive devaluations and the collapse of the gold standard adherence in Europe drove further capital flight to the perceived safety and scale of the U.S. economy. The ultimate financial masterstroke came with the outbreak of World War II. Again, the U.S. remained an industrial supplier for the first years of the conflict. The war's immense scale meant that Allied nations, particularly Britain, rapidly exhausted their remaining gold reserves and liquid assets. To circumvent the U.S. Neutrality Acts and provide essential aid, President Roosevelt instituted the Lend-Lease Act in 1941. This mechanism, while ostensibly providing aid for democracy, functioned as a binding commercial and geopolitical contract, transferring massive amounts of military and industrial equipment to the Allies, with the understanding that payment either in kind or in future strategic concessions would eventually be required. The true genius of the World War II era was that the U.S. ensured it would emerge as the sole industrial power intact. While Europe and Asia were ravaged by relentless bombing and ground warfare, the American industrial heartland was protected. The U.S. spent the war years operating its factories 24/7, not only meeting domestic defense needs but supplying the material requirements for the entire Allied war effort. By 1945, the contrast was absolute. Europe was reduced to rubble, its industrial competitors were eliminated, and the United States held the overwhelming majority of the world's official gold reserves. This concentration of gold, the ultimate measure of monetary trust and financial strength at the time, was the physical manifestation of American financial supremacy. The U.S. had achieved, through two global conflicts, an unprecedented conversion of its rivals' destruction into its own financial and industrial capital. It was no longer a major power competing in a world of equals, it was the sole financial leviathan. This historical context provides the only logical foundation for the single most important financial agreement of the 20th century, the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference. Held in the final throes of the war, this conference formalized the New World Financial Order, placing the United States at the very center. The agreement established the dollar as the world's primary reserve currency, pegged at a fixed rate to gold $35 per ounce. All other major world currencies were, in turn, pegged to the dollar. In one masterstroke, the U.S. effectively transitioned from being the world's largest creditor, which it already was, to being the world's banker. The dollar became the ultimate unit of account, the medium of exchange for global trade, and the store of value for central banks worldwide. This transition from debtor to banker was secured not by military conquest, but by financial control of the post-war reconstruction. It guaranteed the U.S. an asymmetrical advantage that would be leveraged for decades. The exorbitant privilege, the cornerstone of its modern superpower status, which we will analyze further, but whose genesis lies entirely within the destructive and transformative economic dynamics of the two world wars. The foundation was laid when Europe exhausted its blood and capital, leaving America to hold the gold and write the rules. The exorbitant privilege, the dollar weapon, the foundation of America's superpower status, forged in the financial crucible of the world wars, found its ultimate expression and enduring mechanism in the concept of the exorbitant privilege, the strategic weaponization of the U.S. dollar itself. This privilege is the single most powerful, least understood, and most consistently leveraged component of the American geopolitical playbook, transforming the dollar from a mere currency into the indispensable anchor of the global financial system. The journey to this dominance was formalized in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference. As analyzed, The U.S. emerged from the Second World War holding roughly two-thirds of the world's gold reserves, a factual reality that afforded it the unique authority to dictate the terms of the post-war global financial order. The Bretton Woods Agreement established a system of fixed exchange rates, but critically, it pegged the value of the dollar to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. In turn, all other major world currencies were pegged to the dollar. This made the dollar the world's de facto reserve currency, the only currency that was convertible into gold, establishing its global preeminence. This institutional arrangement conferred upon the United States the exorbitant privilege, a term coined by former French finance minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing in the 1960 seconds, recognizing the immense, asymmetrical advantage granted to the U.S. government. The privilege is the ability for the United States to purchase goods, services, and assets from anywhere in the world, simply by issuing its own currency. Currency that the rest of the world must accept and, crucially, hold as reserves. The operation of this privilege creates a powerful, self-sustaining financial feedback loop. Diagram illustrating the flow of trade, goods to U.S. versus capital dollars back to U.S. treasuries. When the U.S. runs a massive trade deficit, meaning Americans consume more imported goods than they export the dollars paid out to foreign exporters. China, Germany, Japan, etc., do not stay in those nations' consumer markets. Instead, those dollars must be recycled back into the U.S. financial system, primarily by being invested in the safest, most liquid assets available, U.S. Treasury securities. Foreign central banks are forced to buy and hold vast quantities of U.S. debt to manage their own currency's exchange rate and maintain liquidity. The result is that the U.S. effectively finances its own national consumption, its military spending, and its perpetual debt by issuing currency that its rivals and trade partners are compelled to accept and fund. The world provides the goods. The U.S. provides the dollars, which then return as cheap, abundant capital. This unique ability shields the U.S. from the typical market discipline that would devastate other nations running similar, persistent deficits. A nation like Argentina or Turkey running chronic trade deficits would face currency collapse and crippling interest rates. The U.S. faces relatively benign market conditions because its currency is the world's primary reserve. This dollar dominance survived its greatest challenge, the Nixon shock of 1971. By the late 1960 seconds, U.S. spending on the Vietnam War and various domestic social programs led to global skepticism regarding the U.S. commitment to maintaining the dollar-to-gold peg. Foreign nations began demanding gold for their excess dollars, rapidly draining U.S. reserves. In August 1971, President Richard Nixon unilaterally suspended the convertibility of the dollar into gold, effectively ending the Bretton Woods system. Conventional economic wisdom suggested this move should have shattered the dollar's reserve status. The U.S. government, however, moved quickly to solidify the dollar's dominance, using an alternative, even more powerful geopolitical mechanism, the petrodollar system. In the mid-1970 seconds, the U.S. negotiated a critical covert agreement with Saudi Arabia, the largest oil exporter. The deal essentially mandated two things. First, that Saudi Arabia price its vast oil exports exclusively in U.S. dollars, and second, that it recycle a significant portion of its oil revenue back into U.S. Treasury securities. This arrangement, quickly adopted by other OPEC nations, ensured that oil, the essential commodity powering the global industrial economy, must be purchased with dollars. Any nation needing oil, whether Germany, Japan, or Brazil, was compelled to secure dollars, thereby enforcing global demand for the currency and protecting its reserve status, entirely decoupled from gold. The petrodollar system transformed the dollar from a gold-backed currency into an oil-backed currency, further cementing its indispensable global role and tightening the geopolitical chokehold the U.S. held over energy-dependent nations. In the modern era, this privilege has evolved into the financial weaponization of the dollar. The U.S. Treasury and the Federal Reserve now possess the most potent geopolitical tools in the world, far exceeding the reach of the U.S. military, in many instances. Control over the global financial messaging system, SWIFT, and the dollar clearing mechanisms allows the U. to unilaterally impose sanctions that can cripple entire national economies, financial institutions, or even individual oligarchs by cutting off their access to the dollar system. The most notable recent examples, sanctions against Iran, Venezuela, and the freezing of Russian central bank assets, demonstrate the awesome power of this weapon. By weaponizing the currency, the U.S. forces adherence to its foreign policy objectives through financial coercion, demanding that global banks choose between doing business with the sanctioned entity or retaining their essential access to the dollar-based global financial ecosystem. While there is persistent noise about the de-dollarization trend, led by nations like China and Russia, the BRICS bloc, the reality is that the dollar's dominance remains fundamentally unassailable in the medium term. This is not due to political goodwill, but due to the lack of a viable alternative. No other currency system offers the combined benefits of the U.S. dollar, the depth and liquidity of the U.S. Treasury market, a commitment, however imperfect, to the rule of law, and a robust and transparent payment infrastructure. Until an alternative can provide these features, the world must continue to rely on the dollar, ensuring the U.S. can continue to finance its debt, consumption, and military projection through the unparalleled power of the exorbitant privilege. This strategic control over the global financial operating system is the second enduring pillar of the hidden formula for American superpower status: state-funded innovation and risk transfer. The narrative surrounding American economic dynamism is perpetually dominated by the myth of the lone garage inventor, the visionary venture capitalist, and the relentless competitive spirit of Silicon Valley. While this narrative of private enterprise and risk-taking is culturally powerful, it obscures the third, and perhaps most crucial, pillar of the hidden formula for American superpower status: the systematic, massive, and continuous state funding of foundational technology, followed by a strategic risk transfer mechanism that shifts the immense cost and failure rate of early-stage research from the taxpayer to the private sector, reserving the ultimate commercial profit for private enterprise. This pillar stands in direct contradiction to the laissez-faire rhetoric often espoused in American political discourse. The true driver of revolutionary, market-creating innovation in the United States has consistently been the entrepreneurial state, primarily through its defense and intelligence agencies. The state assumes the role of the ultimate, patient, and risk-tolerant venture capitalist, financing the decades-long, high-failure rate research that is too uncertain and too costly for private capital to initially bear. The most prominent example of this mechanism is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA. Established in 1958 in response to the Soviet launch of Sputnik, DARPA was deliberately structured to be insulated from short-term political and market pressures, allowing it to fund high-risk, high-payoff research that often had no immediate commercial application. This agency, along with other federal institutions like the National Science Foundation, NSF, and the National Institutes of Health, NIH, did not just support innovation. They directly created the foundational technologies that underpin the modern global economy. Consider the bedrock of the digital age: the Internet. The original precursor, ARPANET, was entirely conceived, designed, and funded by DARPA. Similarly, the foundational components that make the Internet and modern communication functional, packet switching, the TCP/IP protocols, and the user interface that would eventually become the World Wide Web, were all nurtured with public dollars over decades of often frustrating research. The narrative of Apple's genesis is another compelling example. The core components that define the modern iPhone: GPS, touchscreen technology, Siri-like voice activation, microchips, and high-density computing, were all either invented, substantially funded, or brought to a technological readiness level by various federal agencies before they were integrated by Apple for commercial success. The GPS system itself was developed, launched, and maintained by the U.S. Department of Defense, requiring billions in taxpayer dollars for satellite construction and launch, providing a globally available, free utility that is now essential for nearly every mobile application. This sophisticated strategy is best described as the strategic risk transfer mechanism. The state finances the initial high-risk research, phase 1, 2, and often 3 of basic science, tolerates the near certainty of early failure, and ensures the technology reaches a point of technological readiness where the risk of commercialization becomes palatable to private venture capital. At this critical juncture, the intellectual property, IP, and perfected technology often generated at taxpayer expense, are transferred to the private sector through licensing, defense contracts, or open-source availability for commercial refinement and mass production. The benefit to the U.S. private sector and, consequently, to American financial power is immense. Private corporations reap the enormous profits generated by revolutionary, market-creating technologies without having incurred the initial crippling R&D costs or the political risk of early failure. This unique framework allows U.S. corporations to dominate global high-tech sectors, from pharmaceuticals, NIH funding for foundational biological research, to computing and aerospace, providing them with an unparalleled competitive edge that is effectively subsidized by the U.S. Treasury. This is the ultimate form of state industrial policy, executed discreetly and efficiently under the guise of national defense and basic science. Furthermore, this state funding mechanism is perpetually sustained and justified by the massive, continuous expenditure on defense. The annual defense budget, often exceeding $750 billion, is not merely an expenditure on security. It is the world's largest, most consistent source of demand and funding for advanced technology. This guaranteed demand underwrites entire industries, from aerospace to advanced microchip manufacturing. Programs like the recent CHIPS and Science Act are merely the latest iteration of this industrial policy, directly subsidizing domestic semiconductor production, thereby reducing geopolitical supply chain risk, while simultaneously ensuring U.S. firms dominate the next generation of chip technology. The military imperative is the financial shield that allows American industry to lead. The financial implication of this risk transfer is the concentration of intellectual and financial capital. Because the U.S. government funds the most cutting-edge revolutionary research, it naturally attracts the world's top scientific and engineering talent, the brain drain we will further analyze. The resulting intellectual property IP remains within the U.S. ecosystem, feeding a continuous cycle of innovation and wealth creation that is difficult for any other nation to replicate without similar levels of political commitment and fiscal capacity. The vast, often hidden, public investment is the foundational fuel of Silicon Valley's multi-trillion-dollar valuation, ensuring that the returns on public effort are overwhelmingly captured by private American capital. The political system reinforces this structure by celebrating the commercial success, the Apple iPhone, the Google search engine, while largely obscuring the taxpayer funding that made the underlying technology possible. This maintenance of the myth of the garage inventor allows the system to continue the strategic transfer of risk and the privatization of profit, ensuring that the third pillar, state-funded innovation and risk transfer, remains a core, non-negotiable element of America's superpower formula: geopolitical capital control and global talent. The financial and technological dominance secured by the dollar weapon and state-funded innovation finds its ultimate reinforcement in the fourth pillar of the American superpower formula: the strategic exercise of geopolitical capital control, coupled with the systemic advantage of attracting and harnessing global talent. This pillar focuses not just on creating wealth domestically, but on ensuring that the global flows of both money and intellectual capital are continuously directed towards the United States, thereby reinforcing its financial and innovative supremacy at the expense of its rivals. The historical blueprint for this capital control was laid bare in the immediate aftermath of World War II, most notably through the Marshall Plan. Often lauded purely as an act of American generosity and humanitarian aid, the Marshall Plan's true function was multifaceted and ruthlessly strategic. It was an essential mechanism for securing American geopolitical control over the devastated economies of Western Europe and cementing the dollar's role in reconstruction. The aid was not merely a blank check; it was carefully structured to serve American interests. Funds were often tied to the purchase of American-made goods, ensuring that the aid directly stimulated demand for the U.S. industrial capacity that had been operating at peak efficiency throughout the war. Furthermore, the plan required European recipients to adopt specific pro-market policies and, critically, to align politically against the burgeoning Soviet threat. The plan effectively prevented the emergence of competing independent economic blocs in Europe and solidified a relationship of political and financial dependency, ensuring that European reconstruction was financed, structured, and dominated by U.S. capital and political authority. The Marshall Plan transformed former industrial rivals into financial and military dependents. This geopolitical control extends today through the subtle yet pervasive advantage of rule of law as a capital fortress. In an unstable global environment, characterized by geopolitical volatility, unpredictable seizures of assets, and shifting political regimes, the U.S. legal and political system, despite its internal partisan conflicts, remains the world's unparalleled safe haven for global capital. The system of enforceable contracts, robust property rights, and a judiciary largely independent of executive political interference provides an essential security blanket for wealth accumulated globally. Wealthy individuals, corporations, and sovereign funds from less predictable regimes, whether from emerging markets or autocratic states, routinely choose to denominate their assets in U.S. dollars and invest in U.S. markets, treasury securities, and real estate. This continuous silent inflow of capital provides immense liquidity and cheap financing for the U.S. economy, further reinforcing the dollar's status and shielding the U.S. from the financial pressures that would cripple nations with weaker legal institutions. This stability is a non-negotiable component of the superpower formula. Crucially, capital control is inextricably linked to the control of global talent. The U.S. has a systemic, unmatched ability to skim the top intellectual capital from around the world, creating a perpetual brain drain that continually fuels its innovation engine. The world's most ambitious and highly educated individuals, engineers from India, software developers from China, and leading scientists from Europe are systematically attracted to the U.S. by the promise of world-class research universities, the unparalleled funding opportunities in Silicon Valley, and the sheer scale of the U.S. economy. The financial feedback loop here is devastatingly efficient for the U.S. and debilitating for its rivals. Foreign nations invest heavily in the education and training of their top students, only to see the most innovative, productive cohort emigrate to the U.S., where the state-funded innovation ecosystem DARPA provides the cutting-edge facilities and private venture capital provides the enormous financial reward. These immigrants fill the critical skills gaps, launch the next generation of U.S. tech companies, pay taxes, and drive innovation, while their home countries suffer a permanent loss of their most valuable human capital. The U.S. is essentially able to import the finished product of global educational systems at zero cost, ensuring its dominance in critical fields like AI, quantum computing, and biotechnology. This combination of political control, legal stability, and talent magnetism creates an economic environment where success breeds further success. Global capital flows to the U.S. because it is the safest, most liquid market, and it is the safest, most liquid market because it consistently attracts the best talent and protects private wealth under a robust legal framework. This continuous recycling of global resources, both financial and human, into the American ecosystem is the enduring final pillar of the hidden formula, ensuring that the U.S. maintains its insurmountable lead, irrespective of any short-term political or economic turbulence. The true power of the USS lies not just in its borders, but in its ability to dictate where the world's most valuable resources reside. The superpowers, fragility, and future. Having meticulously analyzed the historical mechanisms of the hidden formula, the strategic transformation into the world's banker, the weaponization of the dollar, state-funded innovation, and the control of global capital and talent, we must now pivot to the critical counterpoint: the inherent fragility and the uncertain future of this superpower structure. The very elements that conferred unmatched power upon the United States also introduce unique, existential vulnerabilities that define the current geopolitical and financial risk landscape. Understanding these tipping points is essential for any investor or citizen navigating the coming decades. The central point of fragility lies in the debt leverage paradox. The exorbitant privilege grants the U.S. the unique ability to run persistent, massive trade deficits and national debt now exceeding $35 trillion without suffering the crippling currency collapse or hyperinflation that would destroy any other nation's finances. This is because the world needs dollars to trade, forcing foreign central banks to absorb U.S. debt. However, this mechanism is not immune to economic laws, it merely bends them. The long-term, continuous expansion of debt introduces two severe creeping risks. The first is the tipping point of credibility. While foreign nations must hold dollars, they are not obligated to trust U.S. financial management indefinitely. The sheer volume of debt raises legitimate questions about the U.S. government's willingness and ability to service this debt without resorting to the silent tax of inflation. As debt servicing costs consume an ever-increasing portion of federal revenue, the perceived risk of U.S. fiscal management increases. Should global central banks collectively decide to diversify even a small percentage of their reserves away from U.S. treasuries, perhaps toward gold, the euro, or a basket of currencies, the immense, structural demand for the dollar would weaken, driving up U.S. interest rates, collapsing asset valuations, and exposing the U.S. economy to painful market discipline. This systemic trust is the fragile hinge upon which the entire financial superpower status swings. The second fragility is the internal threat of entrenched inflation. When the government funds massive expenditures, whether through military spending, industrial policy like the CHIPS Act, or social programs by printing money and issuing debt, the risk is transferred to the American saver. Inflation acts as a silent tax, devaluing the purchasing power of the dollar and punishing those who rely on stable, fixed incomes. While inflation may temporarily deflate the value of the debt, allowing the U.S. percent to pay back its obligations with cheaper dollars, the long-term consequence is social instability and a reduction in real wealth for the average citizen. The Federal Reserve is caught in an impossible bind. Fighting inflation requires interest rate hikes that could trigger a deep recession and threaten the solvency of the national debt structure. Allowing inflation undermines the dollar's long-term value and the public trust. The geopolitical dimension introduces the second major vulnerability, the challenge of the counter-formula. The U.S. is no longer the sole architect of the global economic structure. China, recognizing the power of the U.S. playbook, has developed a coherent, structural counterformula aimed at challenging U.S. economic hegemony. This counterformula is based on state-directed industrial policy, for example, Made in China 2025, massive infrastructure lending via the Belt and Road Initiative to secure resources and political influence, and a concerted effort to bypass the dollar in trade settlement. China is actively seeking bilateral agreements to conduct trade in local currencies, incrementally chipping away at the petrodollar's dominance, particularly in commodity markets. However, the U.S. formula holds an advantage that China has thus far been unable to replicate: the sanctity of capital. While China offers scale and state backing, it lacks the independent rule of law and the capital account convertibility that global financial institutions demand. The arbitrary regulatory shifts, sudden political crackdowns on private enterprise, and the inherent lack of transparency in the Chinese financial system prevent the yuan from becoming a truly viable, globally trusted reserve currency. The U.S. superpower structure is therefore protected not only by its own strengths, but by the systemic weaknesses and self-imposed limitations of its primary geopolitical rival. The stability provided by U.S. legal and political institutions remains the ultimate, intangible fortress for global capital. The final element of fragility is the risk to the innovation pipeline. While the U.S. has masterfully engineered the global talent brain drain, the political climate, specifically restrictive immigration policies and geopolitical tensions with countries like China, threatens to choke off this vital source of human capital. Should the U.S. play become less welcoming to top international talent, or should competing nations develop equally attractive research ecosystems, the foundational state-funded innovation structure will slow down. The U.S.'s competitive advantage relies on continuously importing the world's best minds. Jeopardizing this flow introduces a systemic risk to future technological and economic growth. For the shrewd investor, the recognition of these fragilities is crucial for portfolio positioning. The goal is to profit from the privilege while hedging the fragility. This means maintaining core positions in U.S. mega-cap technology and defense contractors, the direct beneficiaries of DARPA funding and guaranteed military spending, as these companies are fundamentally subsidized by the superpower's structural mechanics. Simultaneously, one must hedge the risks of debt and inflation. This involves investments in hard assets, real estate, commodities, treasury inflation-protected securities, TIPS, and non-dollar denominated assets in fiscally conservative nations. The superpower's fragility does not signal an imminent collapse, but it does mandate a defensive investment posture against the rising tide of debt and the silent erosion of inflation, ensuring that one is prepared for the inevitable cost of maintaining the world's most powerful economic empire. We have concluded the meticulous dissection of the hidden formula, peeling back the layers of history, finance, and geopolitics to expose the true, engineered architecture of American superpower status. The central takeaway is undeniable. U.S. dominance is not merely a matter of technological innovation, but a strategic financial structure built upon the exorbitant privilege, the calculated transfer of R&D risk from the state to the private sector, and the unwavering control of global capital and talent flows. Understanding this ruthless playbook is no longer an academic exercise. It is an absolute necessity for anyone seeking to preserve or grow wealth in the modern era. The implications for every investor and global citizen are profound. The current geopolitical landscape is defined by the tension between the enduring power of the dollar weapon and the inherent fragility introduced by soaring national debt and entrenched inflation. The U.S. system is designed to externalize its costs, forcing the world to fund its consumption and making its own citizens pay for fiscal profligacy through the silent tax of inflation. You cannot afford to be passive. You must recognize that the actions of the Federal Reserve and the U.S. Treasury, the architects of this system, are the most powerful market movers in the world, and your investment strategy must align with their underlying structural goals. This knowledge transforms risk into opportunity. By recognizing that U.S. mega-cap tech and defense contractors are fundamentally subsidized by decades of taxpayer-funded DARPA research, you can position your portfolio to directly benefit from this strategic risk transfer. By understanding that the dollar's reserve status is still the ultimate defense against national debt, you are equipped to make informed hedging decisions. Conversely, by ignoring this hidden formula, you remain susceptible to the financial shocks and inflationary erosion that are the inevitable costs of maintaining the empire. Our mission at Secret Wealth Tactics is to empower you with this crucial structural knowledge, the information the mainstream media often overlooks. We move beyond headlines to dissect the mechanisms of power that truly drive global financial markets. If you are ready to stop being a passive consumer of financial news and start becoming a strategic participant who understands and leverages the geopolitical and financial blueprints of the world's most powerful economy, then your action is clear. You cannot afford to ignore the playbook of the world's most powerful economy. If you want to leverage these hidden truths for your own financial gain, make sure you subscribe to Secret Wealth Tactics right now and turn on those notifications. We will continue to reveal the hidden formulas that shape your financial future.